The locket hit the floorboards of the sheriff's office with a sound like a gunshot, and Savannah Norris felt every single year of her grief slam back into her chest at once. "Where did you get that?" Her voice came out wrong. Too raw. Too broken for a woman who had spent 3 years learning how not to break. The man standing across from her was tall, dust-covered, and wearing a Marshal's badge that caught the late afternoon light like a warning. His jaw was set hard, his dark eyes unreadable, his hat pushed back just enough that she could see the tension along his brow. He did not reach for the locket. He simply stood there, letting her look at it where it lay on the desk between them, as if he understood that the distance between her and that small gold oval was the most important distance in the room. "Found it," he said, "in Caldwell County, on a man named Decker." Her stomach dropped. "Decker, he's in custody. He won't trouble you again." The Marshal's voice was low and controlled, but there was something underneath it, something she could not name yet, something that felt like it cost him to keep his voice steady. "But I had to know who it belonged to. Decker said he wanted off a dead woman. I didn't believe him. She wasn't dead when he took it." Savannah's hand moved before her mind gave the order, fingers hovering over the locket without touching it. She was close, but she wasn't dead. The silence stretched between them like wire pulled too tight. "Who was she?" he asked. Savannah finally looked up from the locket and met his eyes fully for the first time. What she saw there was not the cold, relentless authority she had braced for. It was something quieter. Something dangerously close to the same thing she felt every time she looked at that locket in her memory, in the place inside her heart where she still kept it, because the real one had been gone for 3 years. "My mother," she said. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he picked up the locket, crossed the room, and held it out to her, not dropping it into her palm, holding it, steady and deliberate, so she had to reach for it, so she had to choose to take it back. The moment her fingers closed over the warm gold and her knuckles brushed the rough skin of his hand, something shifted in the room. Something that had nothing to do with the locket and everything to do with it. She would not understand until much later how far he had come to do this one thing. She would not understand until later that it had not been duty that drove him across 3 counties of dust and hard country and dangerous men. But that moment, that single point of contact, was where it truly began. 3 weeks earlier, Marshal Quincy Reardon had been exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was paid to do. The town of Farrow's Bluff sat on the edge of Hale County, Texas, in the summer of 1882, and it smelled like every other frontier town he had worked in for the past 9 years. Dust and horse sweat and wood smoke, and the particular desperation of people who had come west believing the land owed them something. Quincy had stopped believing the land owed anyone anything around the time he was 25. He was 31 now, and that belief had only hardened into certainty. He had come to Farrow's Bluff chasing a man named Cole Decker, who had outstanding warrants in 3 counties for theft, assault, and the murder of a freight driver outside of Lubbock. Decker was smart, and Decker was fast, and Decker had the kind of luck that bad men sometimes carried with them like a second skin, and he had been 3 steps ahead of Quincy for the better part of 6 weeks. But luck runs out. Quincy found him in a card game at the back of a saloon called the Brass Rail, which had not been built to inspire confidence and did not. Decker was winning, which meant he was cheating, which meant the other players were going to figure that out soon enough, and things were going to get loud. Quincy preferred quiet. He came through the back door with his hand near his holster and his badge visible, and he said Decker's name in the particular tone of voice that men in his profession learned early, the tone that cut through noise and drink and bravado and landed in the ears of guilty men like a stone dropping into still water. Decker ran, which they usually did. Quincy was faster, which he usually was. He had Decker face down in the alley behind the brass rail with his wrists in irons before the dust fully settled, and Decker was cursing with a creativity that Quincy might have admired under different circumstances. He patted Decker down for weapons, removed a knife from his boot, a derringer from his coat pocket, and a small brass and leather pouch from inside his shirt. Quincy almost didn't look inside the pouch. It was small and it rattled faintly, and it could have been coins or small cartridges or any number of things a man might carry. But something made him open it. He was not a man who believed in instincts as anything mystical, just experience making fast calculations below the level of conscious thought. Something about the way Decker went still when Quincy's fingers found the pouch told him it mattered. Inside was a locket. It was gold, oval-shaped, about the size of a silver dollar with a small engraved pattern of vines along its edge. The clasp was slightly bent, as if it had been forced open. Quincy pressed it open with his thumb and found inside a tiny photograph on one side, a woman with dark hair and serious eyes and a mouth that seemed to be suppressing either a smile or a secret. On the other side, engraved in careful script, "For my S, who carries my heart. Always, M." He stared at it longer than he should have. "Pretty thing," he said. Decker spat dirt. "Won it fair. Off who?" "Dead woman out past Caldwell. She wasn't going to need it." Quincy looked at the photograph again. The woman in the tiny image was looking straight into the camera with an expression that had nothing of fear in it and everything of endurance. He had seen that expression before, on women who had survived things they shouldn't have had to survive. "She was dead," he repeated. "Dead enough." Quincy put the locket in his own breast pocket, close to his heart without thinking about the symbolism of it, and hauled Decker to his feet. He delivered Decker to the county jail the following morning and filed his paperwork with the efficiency of long practice. He should have moved on to his next assignment. There were 3 other names on his current list of warrants, all of them less dangerous than Decker but still requiring attention. He had a schedule. He had a reputation for reliability that he valued professionally, because it was one of the few things he valued about himself. Instead, he opened the locket again in the quiet of the room he had rented above the general store, held it under the lamplight, and looked at the woman in the photograph until the lamp burned low. He told himself it was procedure. A responsible marshal identified personal property taken from criminals and returned it to its rightful owners when possible. That was true. That was real. He would not be lying if he put that in his report. But he also knew that he had returned confiscated personal property precisely 0 times in 9 years of service. And the only time he had ever come close was when he had found a gold wedding ring in a dead man's pocket and mailed it to the address on the letter in the same pocket. And even then, he had not tracked down the owner. He had simply guessed at a postal address and hoped for the best. This was different. He was already thinking about how to find her. The engraving said S. The photograph showed a woman who appeared to be in her 40s or perhaps older, with the kind of face that had been lived in hard. Decker had found the locket near Caldwell County, which was roughly 80 miles east. The locket was not cheap, which meant the woman who had owned it had not been poor, or had not always been poor, or had valued it beyond its monetary worth. The photograph on the inside suggested a sentimental woman, or at least a woman with someone in her life who was sentimental about her. The M in the engraving was the giver, and the S was the recipient, and the phrase "my heart" was the kind of thing a husband wrote, or a parent, or someone who had loved without reservation. He started in Caldwell County, at the place Decker had described, a rough stretch of road between two small settlements where he had found the woman after her wagon had overturned. Decker's version of events was that she had already been near death, injured in the accident, and he had taken the locket from around her neck and left her. Quincy chose not to think too carefully about the parts of that story that Decker had chosen to leave out. The woman had been found by a passing rancher 2 days after the accident and had been taken to a settlement called Bridger's Creek, where a woman who ran a boarding house had nursed her through a fever for 2 weeks. This information came from the rancher himself, an older man named Harold Gates, who had a long memory and a strong opinion about men like Decker, and was glad to hear he was in custody. The woman at the boarding house in Bridger's Creek remembered the injured woman well. Her name was Maura Norris. She had been traveling east, she had said, to reach her daughter. She had recovered slowly, spoken little about herself, and left as soon as she was able to walk without assistance, heading northeast with a hired horse and what remained of her belongings, Norris. S for daughter. Northeast. Quincy crossed into the next county on a Tuesday morning with the sun at his back, and the locket in his breast pocket, and the distinct sensation that he was doing something that had nothing to do with his professional obligations, and everything to do with the photograph of a woman he had never met, and the inscription that said "My heart." He spent 4 days in Greer County following threads. A woman named Maura Norris had passed through a town called Dry Hollow 2 weeks ago, had bought supplies at the general store, and had asked directions to a town called Stillwater Crossing in Mason County. The storekeeper remembered her because she had been quiet and composed and had paid in silver and had a bruise along her jaw from the accident that she did not explain. "She have family in Stillwater Crossing?" Quincy had asked. Said her daughter lived there. Seemed important to her to get there quick. The storekeeper had paused. Not well, though, you could see it. The kind of not well that a person doesn't say out loud. Quincy had thanked him and ridden on. In Stillwater Crossing, he found not Maura Norris, but instead a small, tidy house on the eastern edge of town, a freshly turned grave in the cemetery 2 streets over, and a young woman at the grave who stood very still with her arms crossed over her chest and her head bowed, and the particular posture of someone who had long since run out of tears and was operating now on something harder and quieter. He did not approach her at the grave. That felt like an intrusion that no amount of professional purpose could justify. He found the sheriff's office, introduced himself, and waited. She came to the sheriff's office herself an hour later, not knowing he was there, carrying a basket of food for the deputy who was apparently her neighbor's boy, and who she fed regularly out of a neighborly habit that the deputy clearly depended on. She came through the door talking, the way people did in small towns where they knew every face, and then she stopped when she saw Quincy. And in that half-second before her expression settled into caution, he saw her face fully and felt something in his chest do something unexpected and inconvenient. She was young, late 20s perhaps, with dark hair like the woman in the photograph and the same quality of seriousness in her face. But where the older woman had looked merely composed, this woman looked like she had been forged from something. Like she had been tested at a temperature most people never reached and had come out the other side still standing, still herself, though the edges were sharp in ways they probably hadn't been before. She was also, Quincy noted with the part of his mind that noticed such things against his professional better judgment, extraordinarily beautiful. He set the locket on the desk before he spoke, because he understood somehow that she needed to see it first, that the locket was the truth he had come to deliver and everything else was secondary, and that seeing it before she heard any explanation would tell him something essential about who she was. It hit the floorboards. He had not expected her to knock it off the desk, but he also understood immediately why she had. Her hand had gone out not as a deliberate gesture, but as a reflex, an involuntary flinching away from something too sharp and too sudden. And the locket had caught her fingers and fallen, and the sound of it had filled the room and filled Quincy's chest, and everything that came after flowed from that single moment. Her name was Savannah Norris. She was 28 years old. She had come to Stillwater Crossing 4 years ago, following a man she had planned to marry. And the man had proven to be something other than what he had promised. And she had stayed anyway, because she had run out of the kind of resources that make leaving possible. And because by then she had built herself a life here, thin and hard and hers. She told him almost none of this in that first conversation. What she told him was that the locket had belonged to her mother, that her mother had died 11 days ago after arriving in Stillwater Crossing in poor health from injuries sustained in a wagon accident, and that she had not known the locket was missing until this moment because she had simply assumed it had been lost in the accident or left with the woman who had nursed her mother in Bridgers Creek. She talked about that locket every day I was growing up, Savannah said. She was standing at the window now, her back to him, the locket in her closed fist against her breastbone. My father gave it to her. He died when I was 7. She never took it off. I know, Quincy said, and then caught himself. The engraving. She turned slightly. You read it. I needed to understand whose it was so I could return it. The silence had a texture to it, cautious on both sides. You tracked it across 3 counties, she said. It was not a question. She was working something out. 3 counties and approximately 240 miles. She turned fully then and looked at him the way she had looked at the locket, with a kind of suspended recognition, as if she was seeing something she had not expected and was not yet sure what to do with. Why? He did not have a clean answer for that question. He had several answers, some professional and some less so, and none of them were complete, and he was a man who did not speak unless he was certain of his words. So he said the simplest version of the truest thing. It seemed like it belonged with you. He saw something move across her face. It lasted less than a second and then was gone behind the same composed steadiness she wore like armor. But he had seen it. He told her he was leaving in the morning, which was true. He had other warrants and other roads and a job that did not pause for personal sentimentality. And he had done what he came to do. He did not leave in the morning. He woke before dawn in the room he had taken at the only boarding house in Stillwater Crossing, and lay in the dark, listening to the town wake up, and thought about the conversation in the sheriff's office with a precision that alarmed him. He thought about the way she had held the locket at the end, not clenching it, not weeping over it, but simply holding it open in her palm and looking at the photograph inside for a long time while neither of them spoke. He thought about the way she had finally said, in a voice very carefully emptied of emotion, "She made it to me, at least. Before the end. That's more than I had any right to expect." He lay there and thought about the word expect, and what it meant, that she had not said hope but expect, as if she had learned somewhere along the way to hold hope at a distance, to keep it from getting close enough to do damage. He ate breakfast at the small restaurant beside the general store, and Savannah Norris came in 20 minutes after him, saw him, and stopped in the doorway with an expression that he was beginning to be able to read, the small tightening around her eyes that meant she was deciding something. She sat down across from him. "You're still here," she said, "leaving this morning." "That's what you said yesterday." He had nothing to say to that. She was correct. The woman who ran the restaurant brought coffee and cornbread and moved away without comment, and Savannah Norris wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and looked at him across the table with those serious eyes and said, "Tell me about finding it. Start from the beginning." So he did. He told her about Decker and the card game and the alley behind the brass rail. He told her about opening the pouch and finding the locket and the photograph. He told her about Bridger's Creek and Harold Gates and the boarding house and Mora's slow recovery, and her determined departure heading northeast. He told her about Dry Hollow and the storekeeper with the long memory. He was precise and factual in the telling, which was how he always spoke. But she listened with such complete attention, with such stillness, that he found himself adding details he would not have thought to include, the particular quality of the lamplight when he first opened the locket, the way the storekeeper in Dry Hollow had paused before saying not well, because he had wanted to be kind, but also truthful. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "She was trying to get to me," Savannah said. "She had been trying for 2 years. We had lost contact. It's a long story. But she wrote me in the spring and said she was coming, and I wrote back, but I don't know if the letter found her in time." She paused. "She made it anyway." "She made it," he agreed, "because of you. She made it on her own. I just returned what was taken from her." "You spent 2 weeks and 240 miles on a locket." She said it flatly, which was its own kind of question. He looked at his coffee. "Yes," she studied him for a long moment. "I would like to pay you for your time and your horse's travel." "No, Marshal, no." He met her eyes. "Please." Something in his voice made her stop. She looked at him for 3 full seconds, long enough that it started to mean something, and then she nodded once and looked away. He left Stillwater Crossing the following day. He actually left this time. He had 3 names on his warrant list, and professional obligations that he had already stretched past their proper limits. And he was not a man who ran from what he was, or what he owed to the responsibilities he had chosen. He rode out before breakfast, before the town was fully awake, which he told himself was efficiency rather than avoidance. He made it 12 miles down the road before the thinking started in earnest. He had not asked her anything about herself. He had spent 2 weeks following her mother's trail across 3 counties, and had barely scratched the surface of who Savannah Norris was, which was the result of professional restraint and personal reticence. And also, he was willing to admit in the privacy of his own thoughts, of the fact that certain questions felt too important to ask carelessly, and he had not had time to ask them carefully. He did not turn back. He was not a man who went backward when he had set his course, but he thought about her with a constancy that he found both irritating and impossible to stop. He served his warrants. 3 weeks passed. He was in a town called Bridger's Falls, which was not the same as Bridger's Creek, working a case involving stolen cattle and fraudulent land deeds. And he was sitting at a desk in the county marshal's office, writing a report, when he found himself writing her name in the margin of his paper, without having decided to do it. Savannah Norris. He stared at it. Then he added a period after the second word, as if that made it a sentence, as if that made it mean something definitive, rather than just the involuntary record of a thought he was having too often. He finished the case in 2 days when it should have taken a week. He worked with a focused efficiency that impressed the county marshal, and was in fact driven entirely by the need to be finished, to have no remaining professional reason for being where he was rather than somewhere else. He rode to Stillwater Crossing. He did not have an explanation that would sound reasonable. He understood this. He was a man of 31 who had spent 9 years building a professional life around discipline and reliability, and the careful management of his own inclinations. And he was riding 200 miles because a woman had looked at him across a restaurant table, and he had not asked the right questions, and he had been thinking about it for 3 weeks. He arrived in Stillwater Crossing on a Wednesday afternoon in August of 1882. The town was quiet in the afternoon heat. The general store was open. The restaurant was open. A group of men sat in chairs outside the barber shop, not talking, the way men in small towns sat together in the heat. He found Savannah behind the seamstress shop on Meridian Street, which turned out to be where she worked, doing alterations and custom sewing for the town and the ranches nearby. She was in the back garden hanging freshly pressed fabric on a line, moving with efficient purpose, and she did not see him immediately. He had a moment of watching her before she turned, which he was aware was an odd thing to be grateful for, but he was. She turned and saw him, and her face went through several things very quickly. Surprise, something guarded, and then, before the guard fully came up, something unguarded that she immediately regretted letting him see. He saw her regret it. He catalogued this. "Marshal Reardon," she said. "Miss Norris, you have another warrant in Stillwater Crossing." Her tone was perfectly level. "No." "Something else official." "No." She waited. He had planned several things to say. He had composed them during the 2-day ride with the thoroughness. He applied to legal documents, working out the exact words and their order. Now that he was standing here and she was looking at him with that direct, serious gaze, and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and her dark hair pinned back in the heat, every prepared word abandoned him. "I didn't ask enough questions," he said. She blinked. That had surprised her. "I'm sorry. When I was here before, I told you about finding the locket and I answered your questions and I left, but I didn't ask enough of my own." A pause, careful. "What kind of questions?" "Personal ones." He held her gaze, because he was committed now, and he was not a man who flinched from things once he was committed. "The kind I should have asked then, but didn't." The silence between them had weight and warmth in the August heat. A mockingbird was going through its repertoire somewhere in the oak tree at the edge of the garden. The freshly pressed fabric moved slowly on the line. "You rode 200 miles to ask personal questions," she said. "Yes." She looked at him for a long time. He did not look away. He stood there in the heat in his dust-covered coat with his marshal's badge catching the light, and waited, which was the only honest thing he could do. "Come inside," she said. "It's too hot to stand in the sun." The interior of the seamstress shop was cool and smelled of starch and clean cloth, and the faint sweetness of the cedar boxes where she stored the finished work. There was a large work table in the center, a sewing machine of the newer Singer style against one wall, shelves of thread and notions along another, and 2 chairs near the front window that had been arranged for customer consultations. She gestured at one of the chairs without ceremony and went to a shelf where a ceramic pitcher and 2 cups were kept, and poured water for both of them without asking. He sat. She sat. She handed him the water and wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked at him with the particular expression he was coming to associate with her, that watchful readiness, as if she had long ago stopped expecting people to behave reasonably, but had not entirely given up monitoring for exceptions. "Ask your questions," she said. "How long have you lived here?" "4 years. You came for a man." She tilted her head slightly. "You heard that already. From the woman at the boarding house where I stayed. She wasn't gossiping. She was explaining why you might be cautious of strangers." Something shifted in her face. "His name was Warren. We were engaged. He came out here for land and I followed him because I believed what he told me." She paused, as if organizing something. "He had not told me the truth about himself. By the time I arrived and understood that, I had sold what little I had to make the journey. I had no way to go back." She said it without self-pity, which made it harder to hear than if she had been bitter about it. "He left inside of 2 months. I stayed and found work and built what I could." "Were you hurt?" She looked at him steadily. "Not physically," he nodded. "And before that, you grew up somewhere east, Missouri. My mother and I. My father died when I was young. She took in sewing and washing, and she was better at it than she ever should have had to be. A small pause. She was a remarkable woman. I could tell, he said, from her photograph. She looked at him with something that was not quite surprise and not quite gratitude, but was somewhere between them. You could tell from a photograph the size of a thumbnail. The way someone holds themselves in a photograph tells you things. She held herself like someone who had decided to be present even for the hard parts. Savannah was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said softly. That's exactly it. The afternoon stretched and neither of them moved to end it. The questions he had prepared in advance fell away and were replaced by something more organic, an exchange that moved in both directions, that built on itself. He told her things he did not usually tell people. About growing up in Kansas, about the older brother who had died in a riding accident when Quincy was 16 and whose death had pushed him toward law enforcement in ways he had only understood much later. About 9 years of marshaling, the particular loneliness of it, the roads and the warrants and the endless towns that were not his. She listened with the same quality of attention she had given the story of finding the locket. It was not passive listening. It was the kind that asked you to be honest, that made careless words feel too heavy to use. You like it? She asked. The work? I believe in it. That's not the same thing. No, she agreed. It's not. You like your work? She considered this genuinely. I like the precision of it. You put in the exact right thing and the result is exactly what it should be. There's a reliability in that. A pause. I like that people come to me because something matters to them. A wedding dress, a suit for a funeral, something for a child's birthday. It's small, but it means something. He looked at her and felt the verb he had been carefully not using press against the inside of his chest with a force that could not be called anything else. It was not infatuation, which was light and based on surface things. It was more serious than that. It had the weight of recognition in it, the feeling of seeing something clearly for the first time and understanding you had been looking for it without knowing it. He stayed in Stillwater Crossing for 4 days. He was careful. He was not the kind of man who rushed at things, and she was not the kind of woman who would have respected it if he had. He called on her each morning at the shop and they talked, and one afternoon she showed him the room at the back where she kept the dress forms and the bolts of fabric, and he understood that this was a gesture of trust, a showing of something that was privately hers, and he received it as such. On the 3rd day, she asked him to walk with her to her mother's grave, and he went. They stood at the headstone, which read simply Mora Norris, 1840 to 1882, beloved, and Savannah was quiet for a long time and Quincy stood near her without speaking because there were no words that improved on the silence. She said, eventually, quietly, "She would have liked you." He looked at her. "How do you know?" "You went 240 miles for her locket." She paused. "She always said you could tell everything about a person from the small things they chose to do when no one was watching." She looked at him sidelong. "No one was watching you out there on those roads." He had no prepared response to that. He did not speak for a moment. "I was watching myself," he said finally. "I always am." She turned to look at him fully, and in the low golden light of the late afternoon, she looked the way the photograph of her mother had looked, serious and present and utterly without pretense. And Quincy Reardon, who had disciplined himself against inconvenient feelings for 9 years with considerable success, felt the discipline give way entirely. He did not act on it. Not then. He was 9 years of professional restraint, and she was a woman who had been let down by a man she trusted, and this was only the 4th day, and there were things that needed to be said before there was any right to the feelings beneath them. On the 4th morning, he came to the shop and told her he had to leave. She received this with the composure that she wore for difficult things, the same composure she had worn for the locket and the story of Decker and her mother's grave. But she was better at reading him now after 4 days, just as he was better at reading her, and they were both aware of this, and it was another form of intimacy, this mutual literacy. "Will you come back?" she asked. She said it plainly, without pretense or coquetry, because she was not a woman who played games with important questions. He looked at her and felt the truth of his answer with a certainty that 9 years of discipline recognized as the only thing that had ever superseded it. "Yes," he said. "I'll come back when? As soon as I can arrange it. I have assignments, but I'll come back in October, if that's acceptable." She was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough that he had time to be uncertain, which was not a state he was accustomed to and which he found he did not mind, because uncertainty meant something mattered. "October," she said. "Yes, that's acceptable." He rode out of Stillwater Crossing on a warm August morning with the dry Texas wind against his back. And the whole road he was thinking about October, which was the first time in 9 years of marshalling that he had thought about the future in terms of a specific place rather than a specific warrant. He came back in October. He had arranged an assignment in Mason County that gave him a professional justification for being in the area, which he told himself was prudent, and which Savannah, when he mentioned it, looked at with a small expression of knowing amusement that she did not try to hide. "You arranged an assignment," she said. "There was genuine business in Mason County, and it required you to be based in Stillwater Crossing specifically. It was centrally located." The amusement in her eyes deepened, and he felt something unlock in his chest at the sight of it, because in the weeks of thinking about her since August, he had catalogued many things, but he had not fully prepared for how it felt to make her smile. He stayed 3 weeks that time. He worked his assignment during the days and spent his evenings with Savannah, and they fell into the kind of ease that takes some people years to find and others never do. He ate dinner at her small house on 3 occasions, and she cooked with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. And they talked across her kitchen table while the lamp burned, and the autumn wind moved against the windows and built something between them out of words and silence, and the particular quality of 2 people paying full attention to each other. He told her about the dark past of it, the years he had spent filling himself up with work, because the alternative was sitting with the loneliness of a life built entirely around other people's crises, with no one waiting for him at the end of any road. He told her this carefully, without drama, because it was true, and because she had a right to know the dimensions of what he was, this man who had shown up with her mother's locket. She told him about Warren, in more detail than before, about the way the betrayal had worked on her, slowly and then all at once, the way she had revised her own memories as each new truth came in, understanding in retrospect the small signs she had ignored because she had wanted to believe. "I stopped trusting my own judgment for a long time," she said. "I kept thinking I had missed something obvious, that I should have known." "He worked to deceive you," Quincy said. "That's his failure, not yours." "I know that now." She paused. "It took a while. Knowing something and feeling it are different timelines." She looked at him with that expression that meant he had said something that mattered to her, the slight softening around her eyes. "Yes, exactly." On the 15th night of that October visit he asked if he could hold her hand. He asked it directly, because that was who he was, and because she had told him early in August that she valued directness above nearly all other qualities in a person, and because the asking was itself a kind of statement that he wanted to make. She looked at his hand and then at his face, and then she said, "Yes," just as directly, and he took her hand and held it gently, and they sat there in the lamplight for a long time not talking, both of them aware that this was the beginning of something they were choosing with full knowledge and careful eyes. He left at the end of October with an agreement that he would write. He wrote. She wrote back. The letters were precise and warm and built the architecture of something that had already been building. He came back in December, and then again in February. On the February visit, he arrived in a sleet storm that had turned the roads to gray mud, soaked through and cold, and 2 days later than he had planned. And Savannah opened her door to him and looked him over quickly, doing a rapid, practical assessment of his condition, and said, "Get inside," in a tone that had nothing romantic in it and everything essential. She made him change his wet things and wrapped him in a blanket and gave him hot coffee and sat across from him and said, "You are going to explain to me why you rode through a sleet storm instead of waiting it out." He looked at her over the coffee cup. "I was late. By 2 days. I said I would be here in the first week of February." She stared at him. "Quincy, I know. You could have sent a letter. I could have. Why didn't you?" He looked at her across the small kitchen with the sleet against the windows and the lamp warm between them and said, "Because I wanted to be here. Not to have sent a letter. To be here." She held his gaze for a long moment. The sleet was loud against the glass. "That's a very foolish reason to ride through a storm," she said. "Yes, you could have been hurt. I was careful. You were not careful, you were determined. Those are different things." But her voice had changed on the last sentence, gone quieter, and she was looking at him with something so open and unguarded that he felt it the way you feel the sun come out after a long gray time. Warmth landing on skin that had forgotten what warmth was. He put down his coffee cup and said, "Savannah." She said his name back, just that, and it was everything. They held each other in the warm kitchen with the sleet outside, and the lamp burning low, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing that needed saying that the silence didn't hold better. Later, when the fire had been stoked and they were sitting together on the small settee in her sitting room with her head against his shoulder, she said, "I was afraid, you know. After Warren, I was afraid I had broken something in myself that couldn't be fixed." He was quiet for a moment, his hand in her hair. "Is it fixed?" She tilted her head up to look at him. "I don't know if that's the right word. It's different, something different." A pause. Something that feels like it came from choosing carefully rather than from hoping blindly. "And you chose carefully," he said. She smiled, which was a rare enough thing that it still moved him every time, a real smile that reached all the way up. "Extremely carefully," she said. "I watched you for 6 months. I know I watched you too. Did I pass? You know you did." She settled her head back against his shoulder. "So did you," she said quietly. "For what it's worth. It was worth everything." He did not say that because it was too large and the moment was gentle, but he thought it with complete certainty. He stayed through February, and then he did something that disrupted his careful professional life in a way he had never allowed and was not entirely comfortable with. He went to his superior, a senior marshal named Daniel Hargrove based in Abilene, and he requested a reassignment that would allow him to work the central Texas counties on a more permanent basis, rather than the itinerant warrant chasing that had been his career for 9 years. Hargrove looked at him across his desk with the expression of a man who was not surprised despite having had no information. "Stillwater Crossing," Hargrove said. Quincy met his eyes. "It's well positioned for the central counties. It is that." Hargrove picked up a pen and turned it between his fingers. "This have anything to do with a personal situation. It has to do with a professional preference for stability." Hargrove looked at him for a moment longer. "You've been one of my best men for 9 years, Reardon. You haven't asked me for so much as a week off in all that time. I know. Take the reassignment." Hargrove wrote something on a paper. "It's yours." Quincy thanked him and rode to Stillwater Crossing and told Savannah that evening at her kitchen table. She looked at him steadily across the table. "You requested a transfer for me, for the Central Counties. They need reliable coverage." She had learned to read through his precise language to the truth beneath it. "Quincy," he met her eyes. "Yes, for you." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and her hand was warm and sure, and they both sat with the weight of what this meant, this deliberate reordering of a life. He found a room at the boarding house and established himself in Stillwater Crossing with the efficiency of a man who had been arranging temporary quarters for years and could do it in his sleep. He made connections with the county sheriff, a reasonable man named Tuck Halliday who was glad to have federal support in the area. He learned the roads and the ranches and the rhythms of the county, and he courted Savannah Norris with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. He brought her books from the general store when a new shipment came in, knowing she had mentioned which authors she had read and which she had not. He came to the seamstress shop on afternoons when she had large orders and sat in the customer chair and talked to her while she worked, because she had mentioned once that the hours of solitary stitching were sometimes very long. He went with her to her mother's grave on the 1st of every month, because she had started doing this on her own, and he understood it was a practice of grief and love that she needed. She, in turn, brought food to the Marshal's office when his days ran long, practical and unsentimental about it, simply leaving it on his desk with a note that contained information about his next meal rather than endearments, which was its own kind of endearment. She mended the tear in his coat on a Wednesday morning without comment, simply having taken it from where it hung on the hook by the door, repaired it, and returned it. She introduced him to the town with a proprietorial directness that made the town understand, without a single formal announcement, exactly what the situation was. On a warm evening in May, 4 months after his transfer, Quincy Reardon took Savannah Norris to the edge of the creek outside of town where the cottonwood trees made their sound in the early summer wind, and he told her everything he had not yet said plainly, because it had grown too large to hold in careful pieces. He told her that she had changed what he thought the future meant. He told her that he had spent 9 years being excellent at a solitary life, and that somewhere in the course of finding a locket and following a trail across 3 counties, he had discovered that excellence at solitude was not the same as wanting it. He told her that she was the most honest person he had ever known, and that this was the most important thing to him, more important than anything else in the long list of things he valued about her, which was substantial. Then he reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring. It was simple gold, without elaborate setting, with a small dark garnet at the center that was the color of deep water. He had spent considerable time selecting it in a jewelry shop in Abilene, which was the most uncertain he had been about a purchase in his adult life. "Savannah Norris," he said, and she was already very still and her eyes were very bright. "I would like to marry you, if you'll have me." She looked at the ring and then at his face, and she was quiet for long enough that the cottonwoods made several rounds of their sound and the creek talked quietly to itself, and a nighthawk went over somewhere above them. "I need to tell you something first," she said. He waited. "When you left in August after those 4 days, I told myself I was being foolish, that this was a man I'd known for 4 days who was going to ride away and not come back, that I was reading things into a stranger's kindness." She paused. "And then you wrote, the first letter. And the letter was so precisely and exactly you, with all your careful words and your habit of saying the important thing plainly rather than decorating it, and I understood then that you were not going to simply disappear." She looked at him, and I was terrified. because I had worked so hard to be all right on my own, and here was something I had to decide whether to risk. I know, he said quietly. I knew that about you. I decided to risk it, she said. I would like you to know that it was a deliberate choice, not something I fell into. Her eyes were bright, but her voice was steady. I chose you knowing exactly what I was doing. He felt that in his chest in a way that no amount of professional discipline could modulate. So did I, he said, every step of the way. She reached out and took the ring from between his fingers and looked at it in her palm. Yes, she said, I'll marry you. He took the ring back and put it on her finger, and she held her hand up and looked at it against the late evening sky. And then she looked at him with the full directness of her serious eyes, and the full warmth of the smile she kept for things that were genuine. And Quincy reared and kissed her in the cottonwood shade by the creek while the Texas evening settled around them, and the nighthawk called somewhere in the deepening blue. They married in September of 1883, in the small church on the main street of Stillwater Crossing, on a morning that was sharp and clear with the first cool edge of fall. Savannah wore a dress she had made herself, ivory cotton with careful embroidery at the cuffs and collar, and she had pinned her mother's locket at her throat above the dress's neckline. And when Quincy saw her come through the church door, he stood straighter than he already stood and felt something in his face that he could not control and did not try to. The church was full. Stillwater Crossing had claimed both of them in the way small towns do, with the quiet possessiveness of a community that knows its own. Tuck Halliday, the county sheriff, stood beside Quincy as his witness. A woman named Clara Webb, Savannah's closest friend in town, stood beside Savannah. The minister was a calm man named Reverend Ames who spoke the service with a plainness that suited both of them. When Quincy said his vows, he said them looking directly at Savannah, because there was no other direction to look, and she said hers back with the full quality of her attention, those clear eyes and that steady voice that had always been able to cut through pretense to the essential thing. He put a ring on her finger and she put one on his, which was her addition to the ceremony, practical and symbolic in equal measure. And when Reverend Ames declared them married, Quincy pulled her gently close and kissed her with appropriate restraint for the location, and the church produced the warm, collective sound of a community's approval. The party afterward was held at the ranch of a couple named the Prestons, who had a large barn and a generous nature, and a fiddle player on their payroll who turned out to be gifted. And the whole town danced until the stars came out, and the air turned cold and the fiddle music went out across the dark Texas plain like a kind of prayer. Savannah danced with Quincy 3 times, which was 2 more than strict propriety recommended, and 1 fewer than she wanted. He was better at dancing than she had expected, which she told him, and he said that there had been considerable time on the road to practice in his imagination, and she laughed with her whole face, which was the thing he loved most about the way she laughed, the way it engaged her entirely. They rode home to the house they had moved into together, a larger house than her previous one, on the north edge of town with a proper kitchen garden and a back porch that faced east toward where the sky went orange and pink at sunrise. The house had been empty for 2 years following its previous owner's departure for California, and they had worked together to make it livable over the previous months, him handling the structural things and her handling the domestic ones. And the result was a house that looked and felt like both of them, orderly and warm. On the porch that first night, with the stars very bright above the flat land and the coyotes talking somewhere in the distance, Savannah put her hand to her throat and touched the locket that had brought them here, this small gold oval with its engraving and its tiny photograph. Quincy watched her. "Thank you," she said, not for the first time but differently than before, more fully, for going after it. "Thank you for being at the end of the road," he said. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her. And they stood there on the porch of their house on their wedding night with the vastness of the Texas sky above them, and the coyotes and the stars and the wind in the grass. And it was exactly and completely right. Time moved the way time moves in a life that is genuinely built, rather than merely inhabited. Quincy's work in the central counties settled into the particular rhythm of law enforcement in a place you know and care about, different from the itinerant warrant chasing of his earlier career, more rooted, more connected to real consequences. He knew the ranchers and the townspeople and the particular problems of the roads in his jurisdiction. He was respected and occasionally feared, which was the appropriate balance for a marshal. His dark past, the loneliness of all those years on the road, the way he had systematically narrowed himself to work and obligation, he felt it sometimes like a scar that had healed but left its mark. He did not try to pretend it hadn't existed. He told Savannah about it in pieces over months and years, as the pieces became clear enough to say. She received each piece with the particular quality of her listening, and she never pitied him, which was what he needed most, because what he needed was to be understood rather than absolved. Savannah's work grew. Stillwater Crossing grew with the slow, deliberate growth of a frontier town finding its permanence, and she grew with it, taking on 2 women to help her in the shop within the first year of their marriage, and eventually expanding into a second room that housed the bridal and formal work separately from the everyday alterations. She was known across 3 counties for the quality of her craft, which meant that the roads Quincy knew for professional reasons became roads she knew for her own. In the spring of 1884, she told him she was pregnant. He was sitting at the kitchen table reading a report, and she came in from the garden with her hands still dirty from the early planting. And she said it plainly and without preamble, because that was how she said important things, and he put down the report and looked at her, and felt something so large and quiet move through him that it took a moment to be able to speak. "Are you all right?" he asked. She looked at him with that edge of amusement she used for his understatements. "I'm very well, Quincy." He stood up and crossed the kitchen to her and held her with care, as if she might be fragile, which she then proved she was not by telling him firmly that she was not made of glass, and he could hold her properly, which he did. And they stood there in the kitchen with the smell of garden dirt and early morning and the particular tenderness of a thing that is newly real. Their son was born in November of 1884, after a long and difficult labor that Quincy spent in the most sustained anxiety of his life, pacing the outside of the room where the doctor and Clara Webb were with Savannah, telling himself with firm professional rationality that childbirth was a natural process, and that Savannah was strong and competent, and that it would be fine, and feeling none of this help at all. When the doctor opened the door and said it was done and both were well, Quincy had to put his hand on the wall for a moment. He went in, and Savannah was pale and exhausted and more beautiful than he had ever seen her, and she was holding their son in the crook of her arm with the expression of someone meeting a person they had always known they would love, and she looked up at Quincy when he came to her side with those clear eyes and said, "Come and see him." The boy was red-faced and outraged at existing, which Quincy understood was standard, and he had dark hair already, and he was, in Quincy's entirely unbiased assessment, the most remarkable thing he had ever seen. "What do we call him?" Savannah asked. They had discussed names. There were several candidates. Matthew, Quincy said. It had been on the list, but saying it now, looking at the boy, he was certain. Savannah looked at the name for a moment inside her mind. "Matthew," she said. She looked at Quincy and smiled. "Yes, Matthew." Matthew James Reardon was a demanding infant and a determined toddler, and a child who approached the world with a seriousness that he had evidently inherited from both parents and a curiosity that was entirely his own. He asked questions from the moment he had language for questions, and did not stop, which Savannah said was because he lived in a house where questions were taken seriously and answered honestly. Clara Webb, who had married a rancher named Pete Foster and had 2 children of her own, said that Matthew was the most solemn child she had ever met, and that it was entirely predictable given his parents. Savannah took this as the compliment it was intended to be. In the winter of 1886, they found out there would be a second child. This pregnancy moved differently, easier in some ways and more complicated in others, and Savannah joked that this one had a stronger opinion about being born than Matthew had. She was not wrong. Their daughter arrived in June of 1887 on a warm evening with a thunderstorm rolling in from the west, announcing herself with considerable force, and Quincy held her in his hands and felt the particular devastation of a man who had thought himself thoroughly familiar with the territory of love and has just discovered a new country. "Eleanor," Savannah said. She was not tired this time, or not as tired, sitting up against the headboard with her hair loose and her color returned. "Eleanor Mora." Quincy looked at her over the baby's head. "Mora. Her mother's name, Eleanor Mora Reardon," he said. "Yes." She held out her arms for the baby. "My mother would have loved this, all of this." She looked down at Eleanor's small, fierce face. "I like to think she knows." "I think she does," Quincy said, and he meant it as more than comfort. The locket lived on the mantelpiece in their sitting room in a small cedar box that Savannah had made specifically for it. She did not wear it every day, only on particular days. Her mother's birthday in March, the anniversary of her mother's death in July, special occasions where she wanted Mora present. On the days she wore it, Quincy always noticed, and when she caught him noticing, she would touch the locket with her fingertips and give him the particular look that they had built together over years, the look that contained everything that did not need to be said, because they both already knew it. The years accumulated the way years do in a life that is full. Matthew started school and proved to be exactly as serious and curious as his earliest self had promised. Eleanor proved to be everything her arrival had suggested, fierce and determined and possessed of a particular charm that she deployed strategically and without remorse, which Quincy observed with a professional respect that Savannah found very funny. Quincy worked his counties and built a reputation that was known well beyond Mason County, one of the most reliable and just marshals in Central Texas. A man who was feared by those who had reason to fear the law and trusted by those who did not. He had his difficult cases and his dangerous moments. The nature of the work guaranteed that, but he came home from every road he rode. And every time he came through the door of the house on the north edge of Stillwater Crossing, he was met by the particular combination of welcome that was his family. And this was the thing that had replaced the solitude he had spent 9 years pretending was sufficient. On an October evening in 1889, 7 years after he had ridden into Stillwater Crossing with a locket in his breast pocket, Quincy sat on the east-facing porch with Savannah as the last of the day turned the sky above the flat land, every shade between gold and violet. Matthew was inside doing his lessons, and Eleanor was asleep, and the house was the kind of quiet that is full rather than empty. Savannah had the locket in her hand, turning it in her fingers the way she sometimes did in the evenings, not with sadness but with the gentle attentiveness of someone tending something precious. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the fact that you came back." She said it thoughtfully, as if working out a calculation. "In August, after you had done what you came to do, you could have simply left and that would have been correct and proper and you never would have had to think about me again." I would have thought about you, he said. But you could have not come back. She turned the locket over. I want you to understand that I know that I'm grateful for it every single day. He looked at her profile against the evening sky. The line of her jaw and the dark hair that had a few strands of gray now that she wore with the same matter-of-fact dignity she wore everything. And felt the accumulated weight of 7 years of mornings and evenings and difficult days and good ones and children and grief and laughter, and the particular profound intimacy of a shared life. I want you to understand something too, he said. She turned to look at him. I didn't come back because I was brave or because I was particularly wise. I came back because I had sat with the alternative and found it genuinely unbearable. He paused. I had spent 9 years being good at not needing things. And then in 4 days in August, I discovered that there was a thing I needed, and that not having it was not something I was willing to accept. She looked at him for a long moment with those eyes that had always been able to see him completely, that had never required him to explain himself at length, because they saw the essentials clearly. Then she reached out and took his hand and held it, the two of them sitting on the porch with the evening coming in from the east and the stars beginning to make themselves visible in the deepening blue. You came all that way for a locket, she said softly. I came all that way for you, he said. The locket was the beginning of a reason. She turned his hand over in hers and looked at it, at the ring she had put on his finger 6 years ago in the small church on the main street. My mother would say that the best things start as small things you almost miss. She sounds like she was right about a lot. She was right about most things. Savannah closed his hand in both of hers. She would have said about you that you were a man who did the thing that needed doing without needing anyone to watch, and that was the most telling thing about a person. She paused. She would have been right. He squeezed her hand. The stars were coming in properly now, the vast Texas sky doing what it did in the absence of other light, becoming infinite and very close at the same time. I have something to tell you, Savannah said. He looked at her. Her expression was the one she used for large things said plainly. There will be another child. In the spring. The stars went on doing what they were doing, and the evening wind moved through the dry grass at the edge of the property. And somewhere in the house, Matthew was reading something aloud to himself the way he did when he was working out a difficult text. Quincy sat with the news for a moment, the way he sat with important things, feeling its weight and warmth and the particular quality of this life. This exact life, which was more than he had allowed himself to want when he had been a man on a long road learning not to want things. Are you all right? He asked. She gave him the look she always gave him for this question. I'm very well, Quincy. Good, he said. She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and she held her mother's locket in her free hand and turned it in the starlight. The small gold oval that had started all of this, that had been carried by a woman who loved someone enough to keep it through everything, who had tried to reach her daughter and had made it, who had left this one small piece of herself for them to carry forward. The third child was born in April of 1890 on a morning of extraordinary blue sky and new green in the cottonwoods along the creek, and was a boy, and was healthy, and announced himself with the same force of presence that Alina had established as the family standard. Savannah, watching him with George in his arms, said, "What are you thinking about?" He looked up at her. "Decker," he said. She blinked. Then she laughed, which startled George and made Alina appear in the doorway to investigate the sound. And Matthew appeared behind Alina with his serious face and asked what was funny. And Quincy stood in the middle of all of them with the baby and the afternoon light, and felt the complete and absolute rightness of every single road that had brought him here. "Decker," Savannah said when the laughter settled, "you're thinking about Decker." If he hadn't been cheating at cards, Quincy said. If he hadn't been cheating at cards, she agreed. And they looked at each other over the heads of their children with the full shared understanding of two people who know their whole story, who have told it to each other enough times that it has become a kind of foundation, something that holds the weight of everything built above it. Alina was trying to see the baby and Matthew was asking a question about Decker that would require explanation. And outside the window of the bedroom, the April sky was doing everything spring skies do in Texas, which is everything at once. Savannah reached up and touched the locket at her throat, the gold warm from her skin, the engraving worn smooth at the highest point of the vines from 30 years of fingers touching it. My heart, always. And she looked at Quincy, who was looking at her. And between them was 7 years of mornings and 3 children and all the roads and the particular form of knowing that only comes from choosing someone fully and being fully chosen in return. The locket had made it home, so had they both.